the man who would become the leader of the Imperial Japanese Navy by the start of its involvement in World War II would have a career that in many ways charted the rise and fall of the navy in which he served. His origins have a direct relationship with the two civil wars that defined the official beginnings of the Imperial Japanese Navy and indeed Japan as a modern nation. The Boshin War of the late 1860s and the subsequent Satsuma Rebellion of the late 1870s, even though both of these actually took place well before he was born. This was because the man known to us as Isoroku Yamamoto was not born a Yamamoto. Note that in Japanese, the surname traditionally precedes your personal name, unlike the English practice of first name and then surname, and so we'll use Japanese practice going forward, since obviously this is about a Japanese admiral. Back in the 1860s, the Nagaoka domain, one of the many semi-feudal style states that made up Japan as a whole, picked the side of the shogunate in the Boshin War, otherwise known as the Meiji Restoration. And for those of you wondering where this was in the Eshigo province, now the Niigata prefecture, which is on the west coast of the island of Honshu, the largest of the Japanese home islands, and is positioned right on the curve where the coast goes from being roughly east-west and starts heading north-south. The shogunate lost that war, and one of the many samurai who fell in that conflict was Yamamoto Tatewaki, who was only 23 at the time. This was a problem for the family, not just because he died, but also because he was supposed to be the heir to the family. But that's the last we'll hear about them for a little while. This particular conflict was the one that saw the birth of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a distinct force. As for the previous few years, the Japanese Navy, such as it was, had been a slightly random collection of warships, many of which had been built or purchased by individual domains, with only a few government-run vessels, with the domains donating their use to government purposes when it suited them. During the war, those ships that were serving the forces loyal to the Emperor had been organised into a single unified force, which was then more formally codified as the Imperial Japanese Navy in the aftermath, which does lead to slight confusion as when exactly the Imperial Japanese Navy was founded depends on whether you take when it practically came into being or when it formally came into being. These two dates separated by a few years. In any case, almost a decade later, the samurai of the Nagaoka domain, although the domain itself had by this point been formally abolished in 1871, showed a consistent and rather dispiriting habit of picking the losing side when they rose in revolt as part of the Satsuma Rebellion, which was centred on the Satsuma clan, formerly the Satsuma domain. They were right down on the southwest end of Japan. This rebellion was eventually crushed, and the government then took further steps to dismantle the old samurai system. This meant that many samurai from the losing side found themselves without any income and facing significant problems with finding new work, as their family names and allegiances immediately identified them as having recently been rebels. Such was the situation faced by Takano Sadayoshi, who then tried to become a teacher, drifting from job to job until he eventually fetched back up in his home province. Having remarried after his first wife's death, he went on to have 3 further children with this new family, the youngest of whom was born on April 4th, 1884, and was named Takano Isoroku, the name meaning 56, as that was how old Sadayoshi was when his son was born. By now relatively poor, the young Takano Isoroku grew up in an environment where simple food and where you were going to get the money to buy it were the primary concerns. He would therefore not receive the formal education that the children of samurai had so recently enjoyed, and some still continue to do, but in some ways this benefited him, as it meant the only educational options open were more recently established or expanded public school networks, which, when combined with a degree of charitable education from missionaries, meant that he received what, for the time, was a modern program of learning that mixed in Japanese moral values and strictures with the latest advancements in science, which in the 1880s and 1890s was still heading forward at what for us these days would be a frankly terrifying pace. Just looking at the naval field, for instance, There were 3 wholesale shifts in the metallurgy of armour, 3 entire changes of propulsion system, 2 changes of propellant, and the introduction of true long-range communications, all in the span of about a decade in this period, which is the equivalent of us today having lived through the early 2010s, where you might just have a community telegraph station and some prop-driven airliners, and then going through all the advancements that would land us with smartphones and jetliners in the intervening period, with personal communication going from weekly letters to daily post to dial-up internet to broadband internet in about the same time, i.e. what for us is about 50 to 60 years of technological advancement taking place in 10. As a teenager, he figured out quite quickly that this education could maybe be the path out of the poverty he lived in, and so he applied himself to his learning intensively, although some habits from this time would remain throughout his lifespan. During the interwar period, while some of his fellows were enjoying the finer foods and delicacies served at a buffet lunch, they were confused as to why he was polishing off over a dozen skewers of plain boiled dumplings, only for him to declare that this was how he'd grown up eating them, and he still enjoyed them this way. Speaking of eating, his determination to win and never back down in the face of opposition also resolved itself at an early age. When he was teased in school over his poverty, which had led him to constantly be on the lookout for anything that could be mildly construed as edible, he was told, "You'll eat anything, but you can't eat pencils." Not to be defeated, the young boy promptly grabbed the nearest pencil and ate it. The year he turned 17, he used the knowledge that he'd gathered in his schooling to apply for the Imperial Naval Academy, and in a service that was increasingly dominated by the families that had served the former Satsuma domain, his admission was the second highest in terms of exam results of any applicant across the entire country. His sparse upbringing was now something of a two-edged sword. Poor early nutrition meant that he would only ever reach a height of 5 foot 3 inches and would struggle to outmass an adult aardvark or even a capybara in a wrestling match, but the Spartan living conditions of officer cadets were nothing strange to him and thus little hardship. In fact, in some ways, the fact they at least fed you regularly was an improvement. Without this hindrance of adaptation, he was free to immediately demonstrate his leadership capabilities, and for those who decided they didn't want to listen to him, his increasing skills in kendo, as he didn't have much of a settling-in period compared to the candidates from better-off backgrounds. Typically, the program for cadets was 3 years at the academy, followed by 1 year at sea. Following graduation in mid-November 1904, in the top third of his class, the young Isoroku was duly assigned to a training ship, the Kanzaki Maru, as its second lieutenant, or at least a candidate for this position. But now events began to overtake the situation. Earlier in the year, the Russo-Japanese War had broken out, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was still in the process of transitioning away from a jeune école-style navy to a more traditional battle-line navy, and had suffered casualties, mostly due to mines, and was considerably smaller on paper than the fleet of Imperial Russia, found that not only did it need every ship it could get, it also needed every sailor it could get. And thus, Isoroku was quickly transferred to the armoured cruiser Nishin, which, thanks to previous battleship losses due to mines, was now part of the 6-strong 1st Division, along with 4 pre-dreadnought battleships and her sister ship, the Kasuga, all under the command of Admiral Togo. Nishin would then be in the thick of the fighting at the Battle of Tsushima. Whilst it was a decisive victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy, poor old Nishin became something of a punching bag, reduced to an almost disarmed wreck by taking multiple heavy shell hits, which seemed to be unusually capable of seeking out the ship's 8-inch main guns. She suffered numerous casualties, among them Takano Isoroku, who had the misfortune to be hit by multiple bits of shrapnel from an exploding gun. Whether this gun exploded as the result of overheating through heavy use or a Russian shell impact is debated in some circles, and indeed eyewitness accounts from the explosion give different versions of events depending on who you ask. Not that it eventually made all that much difference to him, as burning hot shrapnel is burning hot shrapnel. This left him with a deep wound in his thigh, numerous small wounds which would scar all over his lower body, and one particularly errant fragment severed 2 fingers from his left hand. Had his hand been positioned in such a way that he'd lost another finger, it would have been a mandatory discharge from the Navy for him, but with 2 fingers and a thumb remaining on that hand, he was still allowed to serve. Rather than leave his post to seek treatment, he remained at his station for the duration of the battle, and this behaviour netted him a formal commendation from Admiral Togo. Thus, something that might have ended his career completely only months from its formal beginning instead gave him a serious boost for the future. After recovery, he served on a series of ships: the cruiser Suma, the battleship Kashima, the coast defence ship Mishima, and the Murakumo-class destroyer Kagero. In between these cruises, which typically lasted 4 to 5 months each, he was also studying at the Naval Gunnery School and then later at the Naval Torpedo School, completing the basic courses there in 1908 and the advanced courses in 1911. During this period, one of his cruises took him to the US West Coast, somewhere he would revisit quite often during his career, and he would continue to see brief service on other vessels, including the destroyer Harusame, the cruiser Aso, and the training ship Soya, which was a former cruiser itself. By the time he served on Soya, he was now an instructor, and amongst his students on that particular cruise would be the future Admiral Ozawa, which must have been something of an amusing sight given the colossal height difference between the pint-sized but higher-ranked Isoroku and the rather gangly and gigantic Ozawa. Shortly before World War I broke out, he was granted a place at the Japanese Naval Staff College, and during this period, he would receive an offer that he'd have been stupid to refuse. His own parents had died in 1912, and he had several older brothers from his father's first marriage. The chances of Takano Isoroku ever becoming head of the Takano clan were pretty much slim to none. However, you might remember Yamamoto Tadawaki from the start of this video. Well, this particular branch of the Yamamoto family, Yamamoto is a pretty common family name in Japan, had exhausted all options for finding a male heir in their own bloodline, and having come up short, they decided to look elsewhere. The Yamamotos are described in some sources as having been the primary samurai family of the old Nagaoka domain, so they were fairly prestigious, at least in social status. Makino Tadakatsu, the last daimyo, or lord of the Nagaoka, suggested that the Yamamoto family adopt a reputable young man from the samurai families of Nagaoka to continue the line, something that was fairly common practice at the time in Japan. He further suggested that the young Takano Isoroku would be a good candidate. After all, he was a war hero, he was on a fast track to promotion through the prestigious Imperial Japanese Navy, he was from a lower-ranking clan that he had no hope of leading, and thus he had precious little social or material baggage that might complicate things. Thus, whilst in his final year of studies, Isoroku received an offer of formal adoption. Unsurprisingly, he decided to accept, and so on September 20th, 1915, Takano Isoroku became Yamamoto Isoroku. This adoption means that sadly he has no direct blood relation to a previous Admiral Yamamoto, Yamamoto Gombi, who had an absolutely fantastic wit about him, nor was he related to Yamamoto Otokichi, a Japanese mariner who played a rather interesting set of roles in the opening up of Japan, mostly as a translator. Things were looking up for the young officer once again, but as seemed to be a pattern in his life, every advancement turned out to be a little bit of a two-edged sword. As he graduated from Staff College with his new name in 1916 and was sent to the Admiral Staff of the Second Fleet, quite a nice posting, only to almost immediately contract typhoid fever, followed up by appendicitis. After surgery for the latter, he was in recovery until summer 1917, after which he was posted to the Ministry of the Navy, which was a shore-based duty. Whilst he was on this duty, he met and would marry Mitsuhashi Raiko, with whom he would go on to have 4 children, the oldest and the youngest, Yoshimasa and Tadao, being boys, and the middle 2, Sumiko and Masako, being girls. Their births would be spread out over about 10 years between 1922 and 1932. Now a lieutenant commander, he was assigned to the United States as a naval representative. Once there, in 1919, he briefly enrolled at Harvard to get a basic understanding of English before he decided that he now knew enough to teach himself the rest, left the course, and set off to understand more about the country, touring large factories, oil fields, and logistics warehouses, sometimes on assignment and with funding from the Navy, and sometimes simply because a particular industry caught his fancy. These latter trips were largely funded by his winnings at poker and other games of chance, which he had rather quickly picked up at Harvard and became something of a ruthless master of. Somewhere along the line of this overseas tour, he was promoted to commander, found a specific interest in the workings of oil fuel, and partially as a result of his observations of the United States, and partially because he'd been under the tutelage of Ueda Yoshitake, the Japanese naval attaché in the US, he also developed a deep and abiding interest in naval aviation. 1921 saw him return to Japan for a brief stint as an instructor at the same staff college that he'd graduated from half a decade earlier, before heading out to sea once more as the executive officer of the brand new light cruiser Kitakami. However, the skills he developed in the United States meant that he was soon in demand elsewhere, and so after being recalled to the staff college again, he was assigned to accompany Admiral Ide Kenji on a tour of the United States and Europe, in this case because of his English-speaking skills. Promoted to captain whilst abroad, he would actually receive almost every promotion of his career whilst he was overseas in some way, shape or form. He returned to Japan and transferred to the Naval Aviation section of the Navy, starting off as executive officer of the Kasumigaura Aviation Corps. As a somewhat established officer in a relatively new field that was dominated by young, enthusiastic men, it took a little bit of time for him to fit in, but he soon accomplished this, learning to fly and building his expertise in this particular field. By 1926, he'd been sent off to the United States again, and this time he was seen off at the harbour by a formation flypast of his Aviation Corps cadets, and used his time whilst he was in the US to more deeply study American culture and industrial capabilities, lessons which he would apply in the future when it came to planning war with the US. But it seemed that the Imperial Japanese Navy both couldn't get enough of him or decide what they wanted to do with him, and after a couple of years on this assignment, he was recalled back to Japan again and assigned to the light cruiser Isuzu as captain. This would be his first at-sea command. By this point, his lectures on future war with the US Navy included the heavy use of naval aviation and plans to attack Hawaii, although at this point it was to deny a staging area to the US Navy and potentially enable its use by the Imperial Japanese Navy, since of course at this stage Pearl Harbor was not the Pacific Fleet's home base. He was only in command of Isuzu for 4 months. It was essentially a quick check by the Japanese Navy to ensure that he had remembered how to command a warship, because they had much bigger things in mind for him, transferring him to command of the mighty and at that point brand new aircraft carrier Akagi. At one point, an aircraft botched its landing and was about to fall off the side of the ship, only to find itself being hauled back aboard by a combination of quick-reacting deck crew, Yamamoto himself, and a junior officer by the name of Yamaguchi Tamon, who would of course go on to command aircraft carriers himself in World War II. But once again, due to his English language skills, he was called away after not even quite a year in command to help Japan prepare for the London Naval Conference of 1930, which he would attend as a delegate. Whilst there, he would be promoted again to Rear Admiral. There seems to be quite a lot of argument in various sources about whether Yamamoto was in favour of or opposed to the Japanese Navy being restricted by the various naval treaties. Some claim that he was all for it, others that he was totally against it. Looking at the various primary source documents available in English or in readily translatable Japanese, I have come to the conclusion that I don't think either position is entirely correct. Based on his observations of American and British construction capacity and industry, Yamamoto seems to have recognised that in an unlimited naval arms building race, Japan would lose almost before it started. But at the same time, he was opposed to giving up too much. Instead, he seems to have believed that a treaty system that, in his view, was more curtailing US and British fleets than it was restricting Japan's compared to the relative industrial capacity of each, was generally in Japan's interests, but that such a treaty also had to be negotiated so that it was to Japan's advantage. And so, whilst he was broadly in favour of the idea of naval treaties, he was still opposed to some of the concessions that the Japanese delegation made, as he felt these would put Japan at a disadvantage that was large enough that it couldn't necessarily be made up by other areas such as quality of ships or quality of training. His return to Japan saw a 3-year stint as the technical director of the Naval Aeronautics Section. And during this time, he advocated strengthening Japan's own aviation industry, but in a pattern that the Japanese Navy had followed in the 1900s and 1910s with their surface ships, i.e. bringing in as many relevant foreign aircraft as possible to learn as much as possible about them before adapting what they'd learned and combining it with their own expertise to allow them to produce their own craft without any further recourse to overseas technology. To this end, he encouraged the development of all-metal monoplanes and greatly approved of plans to refit Akagi and Kaga with longer single flight decks, which would allow for the employment of these heavier, higher performance aircraft, which needed more room to take off and land. However, he was also cautious about pushing ahead too far and too fast. A proposal that was given to him for an agile single-seat dive bomber that could also potentially work as a fighter was rejected on safety grounds, as with the long range that Yamamoto was demanding of his aircraft, he felt that a lone pilot would not be able to handle long-distance navigation in addition to dogfighting and dive bombing responsibilities. In autumn 1933, he moved on to command Carrier Division 1, which included his previous ship, the Akagi, but once again he didn't manage to quite see out a year in command, as another naval conference, the Second London, was coming up, and since he not only still possessed the still rare English-speaking skills in the Japanese Navy, but also had the experience of attending the first conference, he was assigned and duly headed off to London again in September 1934. He arrived for the preliminary negotiations personally in favour of an extension of the treaty system as long as, once again, it was favourable to Japan, but just before he'd left, he'd received orders from on high that Japan was not going to sign up to any more treaties, and their way of bowing out was to be by making a series of completely outrageous demands which clearly could not be accommodated. Part of these demands would include reducing overall tonnage for the top 3 navies, but that this reduced tonnage would ensure a parity for the Japanese Navy alongside the Royal Navy and the US Navy, terms that clearly were never going to be accepted. He did his duty and made these arguments, but he didn't have to like it. Various other delegates noted that he personally was absolutely, almost certainly in favour of some kind of treaty, but he was relaying what the government had told him to do, and having done so, he headed home via the Trans-Siberian Railway, stopping off in Germany along the way and helping to negotiate an agreement whereby Germany would provide, amongst other things, data on its expertise in the field of dive bombing, whilst Japan would in return send over the specifications of the carrier Akagi to help Germany learn about the construction of aircraft carriers. Disappointed at being, in his view, used as a tool, Yamamoto refused to return to London for the primary disarmament conference, which he knew would be pretty much a pantomime from the Japanese side of things, and he even considered resigning from the Navy outright. He spent most of 1935 at home, but by the end of the year he'd been called back to active duty as the head of the Naval Aeronautics and Aviation Department. This was an area he saw as key, since he was now in charge of anything in the Japanese Navy that flew, or indeed involved flying, and this was the field he saw as the potential decisive weapon in future conflicts. Naturally, this put him in further conflict with the faction of the Navy that was pressing for the construction of the Yamato-class battleships. Yamamoto argued that for all the time and money that was being invested in them, he could build more carriers, buy more aircraft, train more pilots, and all of this would serve the Imperial Japanese Navy's interests far better in the long term. The core of his argument was that a battleship took several years to design, several more to build, and then, to be worth all that effort in the first place, it had to at least remain relevant for about a decade. All told, that design therefore had to be considered frontline for over 15 years from the time it was thought of. Conversely, aircraft development was coming on at such a pace that an aircraft that flew 3 years ago might well be succeeded by an even better model this year, and so by the time the Yamatos were halfway through their first decade, even if you were really generous and considered their keel laying rather than their design point to be the starting point for counting, 4 generations of aircraft would have appeared in the interim. And given the theoretical capabilities of Japanese carriers and strike aircraft now, this would surely leave the battleship obsolete long before it had effectively paid for itself in terms of frontline capabilities. Thus, carriers were a better investment, as once Yamato was in the water, you weren't realistically going to be able to upgrade her guns or armour all that much, whereas the newly proposed Shokakus could, within reason, simply support better and better aircraft. So even if a single Shokaku and its air wing couldn't sink Yamato on the day that Yamato was commissioned, they would be able to do so a few years down the line. And a few years after that, they'd likely be able to sink whatever successor class to the Yamato might then at that point be having its keel laid, thus ensuring the obsolescence of gun-based warships before they'd even hit the water. Unfortunately for him, there was no seriously taken example of an aircraft attack managing to sink a capital warship, whether stationary or moving, at that point in time, the flaws in Billy Mitchell's test being well known in most naval circles and thus largely disregarded. And so, whilst the battleship faction could point to all sorts of battles stretching back hundreds of years, including, of course, most recently and relevantly for the Japanese, Tsushima, as evidence for their case for the construction of battleships, Yamamoto was forced to admit that his position was still, technically speaking, an unproven one. And so Yamato and Musashi were laid down, although Yamamoto did get Shokaku and Zuikaku included alongside them, even if he would have preferred 4 Shokakus instead. However, before internal dissent in the Imperial Japanese Navy could escalate beyond yelling and threats of physical violence, the Imperial Japanese Army turned up to remind them all who the real enemy was, as on February 26, 1936, a cadre of Imperial Japanese Army officers tried to stage a coup. They managed to murder or injure a number of government officials, many of whom were retired Imperial Japanese Navy admirals, and they seemed halfway to taking power. Some young officers in the Navy agreed with the rebels' general stance and showed up as a group demanding that the Navy support the coup. Yamamoto shouted to them in family-friendly terms to go away and stop bothering him. For a few days, it looked like the Army and Navy might actually legitimately go to war with each other, although ironically enough for an Army-led coup, 5 of the 7 primary targets the rebels had chosen were targeted in part because of their previous support for naval restriction treaties. The Navy responded to the situation quite quickly, summoning ships from the First Fleet into Tokyo Harbour and deploying naval infantry. The Emperor took a rather dim view of the rebellion, but approved of the quick naval response to it, whilst at the same time upbraiding the army for their scattered and slow efforts. Eventually the rebellion was put down, although one of their goals, greater military control of the government, ended up being realised. But with the Imperial Japanese Navy able to gain more favour, as the not rebellious military branch and the one who'd suffered attacks when their retired admirals were targeted, one of the big changes was allowing serving military officers to also take political appointments, and the new Navy minister requested/ordered Yamamoto to take up the job of Vice Navy Minister, which he did against his own better judgment, but he turned out to be a fairly skilled politician and would remain in post as political tensions in Japan flared, and several governments came and went in the course of a few years. However, whilst the Imperial Japanese Navy had ingratiated itself in the top echelons of power, the army was on the upswing in influence more generally, and Yamamoto found himself fighting something of a rearguard action to try and curtail the Imperial Japanese Army's initiatives. In this, he was partially successful, in that he managed to at least slow them down, but he was unable to stop them entirely. Once the army had managed to engineer war with China, Yamamoto was often left running around trying to put out the brush fires the conflict caused. Japanese aircraft managed to accidentally bomb and injure the British ambassador in China, as well as attack the US gunboat Panay, and that was just 2 of the incidents that Yamamoto was left carrying the can for. The army was also a strong advocate for a triple alliance with Germany and Italy. Yamamoto opposed this, stating that it would make relations with the US and UK even worse, which in turn would make resolving the China War in any way that wasn't just an eternal shootout or total capitulation difficult, and if the war in China led to war with the British or the Americans, Germany and Italy were too far away and too lacking in naval assets to do all that much to help, and that therefore any such alliance would be detrimental to Japan. Tensions in Japan itself had escalated to the point that Yamamoto was under near constant threat of assassination by both the Japanese army and some of the more radical Japanese navy elements who wanted to escalate the war and ally with the fascist powers of Europe. And then everything got even more unstable and confused when Germany, which is what the radicals were looking to as one of their major allies, signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR, aka Russia, also known as Japan's most recent major enemy, and one with which they had clashed and would continue to clash in the late 1930s. That particular incident forced the latest government to resign, and Yamamoto looked like he was finally going to be out of a job. Recognizing that this latest round of tensions might well actually get Yamamoto killed, outgoing Navy Minister Yoneyuchi Mitsumasa arranged for him to be transferred to the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. This was not at first to Yamamoto's wishes. He knew he'd actually had relatively little at-sea command experience, but orders were orders, and so he threw himself into this new role as well. He could see war was coming, even if he thought Japan couldn't win it, especially because with Yamamoto and Yoneyuchi gone, the opposition to the government signing up to alliances with Germany and Italy was diminished, and Japan had soon signed up to those treaties. When he first heard of this, and the continued plans for Japanese expansion, which included plans to go to war with the US, he said, "This is completely insane. Now the situation has turned out like this, I'll do my best, but I'll probably die in battle aboard the flagship. By then, Tokyo would have been destroyed, and the country will be in terrible condition." It was also at this point in history that he made his famous prediction that if war came, he could pretty much guarantee that the Imperial Japanese Navy could run wild for about 6 months, but after that the situation would be slightly less rosy. However, he was first and foremost a loyal officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy and servant of the Emperor, and so regardless of his personal feelings, if he was going to be ordered to prepare for war with the USA, then he was going to do his absolute best to ensure Japan's success for as long as humanly possible. To this end, he made consistent demands for increased aircraft production and began organising the carriers that he had into the now famous Kido Butai. But matters were coming to a head far faster than even Yamamoto had guessed. In July 1941, the United States, followed soon by the United Kingdom and the Dutch government in exile, declared a trade embargo of Japan, which included forbidding any sale of oil to Japanese interests. This was effectively seen as a declaration of war, economic war at least, since Japan imported 9 out of every 10 barrels of oil it used, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was the single largest oil consumer in the country. Reserves were calculated to last about a year and a half, maybe 2 if they were stretched, and the only 2 choices thus available were to accede to foreign demands and curtail all action in China, or seize control of vitally needed resources, especially oil, well before those reserves ran out. The nearest and best candidate for this was the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch forces themselves were not seen to be a major concern, given their relative strength compared to Japanese forces, but to do so would mean the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to sail past the Philippines, then under US control, and the US Asiatic Squadron. Leaving these forces, which could then easily host the arrival of the US Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor completely unmolested, was clearly suicidal, as it would give the US Navy a perfect opportunity to cut off and annihilate the Imperial Japanese Navy in a decisive battle at the time and place of the Americans' choosing. Equally, the Dutch East Indies were quite close to Australia and British imperial holdings in Southeast Asia. Whilst the British themselves were not seen as much of a direct threat as the Pacific Fleet, as they were a little bit distracted fighting the Germans and Italians over in Europe, Aircraft and ships based out of Singapore and other British-held ports might offer immediate support to Dutch ships, troops and aircraft, as well as potentially launching their own offensives on the opposite flank to the one which the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to be guarding against potential US interference. Thus, whilst some in Japan thought that they could seize the Dutch oil without getting the US involved, Yamamoto was not quite so naive. Any effort would require taking out the Philippines first, as well as seizing British Southeast Asian holdings, which would ensure a zone of safety around their main prize. The British, he thought, could then be sort of ignored in the immediate aftermath, given their other distractions, but the US could not. Accepting from his studies and visits to the United States that a traditional industrial war with the United States would only end in defeat for Japan, Yamamoto concluded that the only chance, long shot though it may be, would be to so undermine their confidence and morale, particularly amongst the American general populace, that even if the US government wanted war, it would be voted out by a population who didn't want to see their fathers, brothers and sons be sent off to die in a war which to them would seem to be unwinnable. The only way to scare them badly enough, and which was in Japan's reach, seemed to be to utterly destroy the US Pacific Fleet in harbour. As the US Pacific Fleet had conveniently moved somewhat closer to Japan from its base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor earlier in 1941 in a somewhat misguided attempt to deter Japanese advances. This would have the double benefit of denying any American government much of a means to prosecute a war with Japan even if they wanted to, at least until they could build replacement ships, which would of course take time. During that time, Yamamoto hoped that further crushing defeats on the US Asiatic Squadron and whatever remnants of the Pacific Fleet might have survived would further sap American morale if the initial attack hadn't done its job quite well enough, and then as a plan C, the Imperial Japanese Navy would establish a layered defense covering half the Pacific, which would hopefully force the US Navy, when it eventually showed up, into a long, grinding struggle where the Americans would have to pin themselves in place trying to take fortified Japanese-held islands, which would give the Imperial Japanese Navy freedom to maneuver to maximum advantage and then attack when they were assured of local superiority of force, knocking out and sinking further US Navy formations, which would hopefully continue to increase war weariness and sap morale back in the US. As we've seen, something like this idea had been percolating in Yamamoto's mind for years now, and even before the embargo made the schedule accelerate, he was already making the necessary plans to hit Pearl Harbor. Contrary to some popular belief, he was not inspired in this by the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto. He'd already begun planning. But the Taranto attack was a useful marker in confirming to doubters that such an attack could both take place and be effective. After all, if the British could pull off that level of attack with a couple of dozen biplanes, how much more devastating would the hundreds of modern aircraft available to the Kido Butai be? The final hurdle was to convince the Navy General Staff themselves that the idea was feasible, and then getting them to agree to send the entire strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier forces, as at first they thought the plan was too risky, and then once they'd been talked down from there, they only wanted to send Kaga, Shokaku and Zuikaku, retaining Akagi, Hiryu and Soryu for immediate attacks further south. But between various exercises, his personal authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, and threatening to resign outright, Yamamoto succeeded in getting his plan through, pointing out that, again, even though it was something of a long shot, in his estimation, any other strategy would ensure that the war was over before it had even begun. And so it was, in late November 1941, that the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful formation yet set sail, with the attack date set for Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a flourish added by Yamamoto, as he knew Sundays would be the day of least readiness for a Western nation that was at peace. He wasn't actually with the attack force. Instead, he was aboard the battleship Nagato, which, along with the rest of the Japanese battleships, was assigned to form a distant cover force for the carriers. From there, he issued the code phrase "Climb Mount Nitaka," signifying final authorization for the attack. And with that, the chain of events that would bring the USA fully into World War II was finally set in motion. It would now be up to Yamamoto Isoroku to deal with the consequences.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.